Hey, dude, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry as I continue my quest for historical knowledge here on the internet. Okay, today we are finishing up the two-part series by Alternate History Hub titled "What If Germany Won World War One?" So, if you hadn't seen part one, there'll be a link down below. You can check that out. And excited to see kind of what they're going to continue on with here. All right, before I begin, if you like the original video, down in the description will be a link to the original video, so you can give them a like and subscribe. If you like what we're doing here, I'd love to have you a subscribe for this channel as well. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Don't speak German, but...
In this alternate timeline, the German Empire, along with the Central Powers, won the Great War in a stunning victory against the Allies. It was not an easy victory, and it was not a quick one, but it was one which redefined the history of the modern world. Conflict has a way of reorganizing the stage along your own terms. This was seen in our timeline when the Allies forever neutered the Germans and Austrians from European politics.
Yeah, see the Treaty of Versailles, right? That completely changed the world, the way that the treaty affected Germany, and definitely sowing the seeds for a second world conflict. And I think that may be one of the biggest lessons we learned from World War One, was how important and influential a treaty can actually be, as it was again the grounds for kind of the next phase of German history. But yeah, going back to the original video and kind of how they're doing this, they had basically just put some different scenarios, I guess, of what what things that could have happened differently. I don't know, just going back to the first video too, I don't know if they really proposed anything that I think really could have happened in a way that it would like just make a victory for the Germans that way, and the Central Powers. But regardless, it's still fascinating, I guess, kind of what they're going to do here. So yeah, I didn't know how much of it was feasible of what they did, but go back to the first video to check more out of that.
The reparations shrunk Germany's economy and territory, making it already fragile once the Depression hit, and the war saw the death of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By now, you probably know the ramifications of this. It was this initial defeat that immediately stopped the Germans' rise to power that had been occurring for the last half-century. A united Germany under Prussian rule was a formidable force. It wasn't a colonial power like Britain, France, or Russia, but it was still one with growing potential. When the Great War ended and the Kaiser fled, this rise was finished. Germany went down the path of Nazism, which would only destroy it further, and led it into being split between two states for 5 decades until the 1990s. This was 80 years of being mostly subjected to foreign powers.
One of the big what-ifs that I had thought of after their first video and talking about what happened, because the Central Powers are definitely can represent the idea of imperialism in a way, just for the fact that you have this German Empire, this Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire, right? So if the Central Powers had won, would definitely the idea of empire as a plausible institution in the modern world have continued on, right? Now you can make the argument there's forms of imperialism, outside of this, and there's definitely a strong case for that. But the whole era of decolonization that's going to happen as a result of these wars, right? The idea of empire basically started dying with these world wars. And if that wasn't the case, would that be just a completely different world we would live in without the massive decolonization, like domino effect that happened from the wars of, again, the decolonization of these empires and independence and creation of new nations in Africa and Asia and all over the world? That's a big time domino effect that possibly could have happened if the war had again been a Central Power victory.
Today, just 2 decades later, Germany is once again the economic power of Europe through a democracy. But it's not difficult to see that a unified Germany probably would have gone down a different path in those lost years. This is part 2. When we left off, the Central Powers are victorious against the Allies. The Russians have been driven to civil war, and due to the territory acquired in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty.
That's one of the obvious ones that people talk about all the time is, if the war hadn't gone so poorly for the Russians, would the Russian Revolution have taken place and would have the Soviet Union been created? Or was it a delay of the inevitable, right? There were a lot of other things that the Bolsheviks had used as part of a platform for sort of their spread, which again puts into the question how much of World War I affected that, right? So if it had gone well, does that mean that the Tsarist government in Russia, would that have continued on? So would that actually, if you think about it, the empire in a way, Russian Empire, be one of the ones that would have kind of lived on in that old fashion as well?
Treaty, which doesn't completely collapse, Germany now is left with a sizable portion of Eastern Europe. You may have flashbacks to World War II, but keep in mind it's not like the Third Reich style conquering the East for Lebensraum. As per the treaty agreement, the Russians allow for the birth of new nations in the Baltics and an independent Ukraine, as well as the creation of the Cossack and Crimean states as well. The Germans begin the redrawing of the map. While these Baltic and Ukrainian states are technically independent, they are loyal to the German economy and the financial system, almost like another entity we all know.
Would they be, though?
But these states, all in all...
Would they be, you think? Loyal that way? What do you think?
Are German puppets, with the German minority in each state being the highest class, including the rulers. This is Prussians, after all. Poland never really is discussed, so their future is muddled, and probably violent. Speaking of which, the Russian Civil War is still, of course, happening, and plans get muddled in war. It's easily foreseeable the conflict in Russia blends into the plans with the Germans, as the conflict spills over. Communists versus non-communists, fighting in many areas of Eastern Europe. The stability of Russia is of the utmost importance to the Germans, as a Soviet state on their border is a catastrophe to the traditionalist Prussian culture. The White Army receives vast amounts of funding, support, and men to the front lines from almost every Western state, from Britain, France, Germany, and America. With this aid from the powerful German Empire, the Whites succeed.
Really? I mean, do you guys agree with that? So you'd still have this Russian Revolution, and immediately you would have this villainization of the communists here under in Russia, and that there would be a unified front of these nations that just fought each other. So getting Britain, America, France, or whatever into it. Now that I know they had kind of in kind of this altered scenario, the United States maybe would never have joined, but they would be unified even after this bloody battle enough to go again be unified to communist Russia. I know I got to think about that more though. I think before I would officially think if that was plausible or not.
And the Soviets are crushed. The Soviet Union never arises, which, if you want the full scenario on that, check out this video. Germany, while the dominant army on the continent, was just that, on the continent. It was always limited by the superior British Navy and, compared to others, always had a lackluster number of overseas colonies. Going into the war, Germany always had the ambition of stripping much of these colonies from their enemies. Had they won, nothing would have stopped this exchange.
Definitely believe this could have happened because the exact opposite happened as a result of World War One. They stripped away the German colonies, stripped them away from them. So all over because, I mean, if you defeat the British, I mean, stripping their colonies, that would be extremely difficult. It's not as hard to strip the German colonies than the British colonies because, first off, for the German colonies, there aren't that many. And it's such a bigger part of the British Empire. That would take probably another huge war just to do that because you're really only just talking about this fighting happening in Europe, I guess. I mean, depending on what the scenario would look like, but I don't think just having that be the opposite would have technically happened. Would have just happened the way that it happened to Germany. If you follow along with what I'm saying, just being able to easily take away German colonies after what really happened in World War One, I don't think that would just be easily the opposite thing that would have happened if it had turned over another way. There'd have to be an invasion of Britain, and that I think that would have to happen. An actual successful one, for them to agree to do something like that. I don't know, your thoughts?
In this alternate timeline, what we see is something called Mittel Africa, or Middle Africa. The German Empire seizes British, French, and Belgian territory all throughout Africa, effectively taking over most of the continent. It was basically connecting the 3 existing German colonies, allowing for one large swamp of land
down south
across
and
the
north
African
there.
equatorial jungle and savanna. A direct empire across much of Africa, and an economic dominant force in Eastern Europe is always a possibility. Rebellions would be put down hard. The likelihood of Germany succeeding at such a huge endeavor across so much land is hard to say, as the Germans lost against South Africa in our timeline. The Great War is over, and to the victor goes the peace. But the peace is only won if the victor is competent, which leads us to discuss the black sheep of the bunch, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. During the war, he was mostly a figurehead, but when he made decisions, they were usually based on emotion and harmed Germany in the process. For Germany to have a successful peace, it would need to figure out the exact role the monarchy would play in this new Germany. The war showed that the Kaiser didn't need full authority, as his generals ran the country effectively by themselves, so the traditional role of the Kaiser wasn't entirely needed, even if Germany won. It's possible, due to Wilhelm's general incompetence, the German government would slowly begin shifting his power away from the monarchy and into the hands of the military or government. This isn't to say a democracy, but it's a step away from an absolutionist monarch.
I guess I could follow along with that. He's not, they won this, so he's not hurting Germany. More success should be going to the military leadership, which, again, it seems like he wasn't necessarily pulling the strings for, thus putting more power to the military than this figurehead monarchy. I guess I could follow along with that, yeah.
In the West, there isn't so much a cultural change, but a shift in its potential. In our timeline, we went down one path, led by Britain, America, and France. In this timeline, that culture is Germanized. As I said in the last part, without the defeat of Germany being a nail in the coffin to prominent monarchies on our timeline, the legacy of monarchs and empires is less black and white.
What a fascinating painting. Is this supposed to be them in the Palace of Versailles, right? The place where the treaty that ended the war, or I mean the treaty that they ended up agreeing to. That's kind of neat, making a picture like that now, totally in reverse now.
Monarchies prove they can still be semi-relevant in the 20th century. The main change here is Germany's legacy in the world.
Support their ad real quick.
Before the war, Berlin was one of the main centers of finance, education, and art in the entire Western world. After the war, the legacy of Germany was a nation surrounded, and after Hitler, a nation which was too dangerous to be allowed to continue. But in this alternate timeline, that legacy never exists. With new victories in the East and harsh treaties against the British and French, the Germans set themselves up to be economic masters of this new order. Just as the United States used World War II and the economic boom to spread its own culture across the world, so too does Germany. When you have a victor, though, there are certainly losers.
What would that look like? I wonder if they'll give examples of what a dominant German global culture would actually look like. Would it be that different? Really?
So too does Germany. When you have a victor, though, there are certainly losers. The defeat at the hand of the Central Powers affects every allied nation differently following the signing of the Treaty of Paris and Treaty of London. Britain, while bitter, would be quick to adapt commercial ties with the Germans. Tensions still exist, however, due to Germany's new influence in Belgium. The British Empire is diminished in Africa as the Germans take all of Middle Africa. Among imperialists, this is incredibly horrendous. The French as well aren't so forgiving. They would have lost 2 wars by then with the Germans, and a national call for revenge is prominent. It's likely the Treaty of Paris is harsh, just as Brest-Litovsk was against the Russians.
So maybe thoughts so far about these 2 treaties that would have ended and been the surrender for the British and the French. I think it would be far easier, not easy, but easier to put a harsher treaty on the French than it would be the British. Because the Germans could basically they could invade France, and so they have leverage, because if they could invade France, if France was to say turn it down. Now a German invasion of Britain is a completely different story, right? That is far more challenging than invasion of France due to all the geographic elements and other things like that. So that's just my thoughts. Yeah, so far about there should be a difference, I would think, in severity, ability to be severe with both treaties.
And new reparations are forced upon the French this time too. Now, if this seems like just a switch of what happened against Germany in our timeline, it's not. After the loss against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in our own timeline, the French were enraged, and mass anarchy and instability reigned. The Paris Commune was one such event where radical socialist troops took over the city for months. France was subject to disaster if it lost another war, which in this scenario, it does. It's likely nationalism and socialism rise in the country as it faces what to do against its enemy to the east.
I think I could follow that so far as possibilities. These conditions could have fostered develop new political and economic ideologies, potentially with nationalism. They had something that was interesting in the first video, which they said if this had happened, what would be the chances of a French Hitler kind of thing? Basically going after revenge and rising through the political forums for almost the sole purpose of destroying the treaty that they felt was imposed upon them. I still think that's something to think about back with this, but the smaller pieces that they're doing here seem to be logically followed.
No matter what, this bad blood between the two nations doesn't go away, and most likely results in another war. Britain and France would become incredibly bitter after this loss. Speaking of allies, I never discussed Germany's, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans.
Before they do that, though, good question. They're almost saying a second world war was inevitable no matter what, right? And I guess that's kind of, at first I was like, oh, really? But then kind of thinking about it, because one thing I'm not unsure of is if the treaty that would have with France, if Germany had won the war, would it have been as harsh as the one that was imposed on Germany in the actual World War I? I'm not so sure that for the fact that the French, especially France and Britain, who were the allies, felt victimized as they felt those the Germans that were being the aggressor, right? So they felt revenge, and they're blaming them for this war. And again, it's like, you started it, and you should really pay for it. And you might think that if you were the aggressor, right, you wouldn't be filled with that same sort of revenge. You wouldn't be bringing these feelings of revenge to this negotiation table, although it wasn't much of a negotiation, but into this treaty, because the actual Treaty of Versailles is full with revenge-minded things, again, because they feel like they are the victims, right? So would that necessarily be the case in this flipped reality? I'm not so sure about that.
Both countries themselves were the sick men of Europe, and it's unlikely they'd survive much longer.
Yeah, they were both failing anyways.
Yet we don't care about that. What was most important was how they died. Demographics are a main issue in the area of Ottoman control. The Great War and the decade following saw an incredible population shift.
I love the Hagia Sophia, such a great building.
Following the war and the collapse of the empire, the chaos which followed saw a population exchange between the Greeks and Turks. In this alternate timeline, the Armenian genocide still occurs. There is deportation, murder, and genocide, on a large amount of the population. The Ottoman Empire,
For the same reason, though, that they believed that they were in conspiracy against the Ottomans, and so the genocide, Armenian genocide, still happens. Yeah, I guess maybe. I guess maybe that is possible. I'm glad they put in that Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire are not... Just because you're an empire does not mean you're on equal stance with other empires, and that's not the case. Ottoman Empire had been in decline and having issues for a long time before this, and Austria-Hungary has had issues since the get-go of their extremely, again, multinational, multi-ethnic empire that was always on the verge of collapse.
a victor in the war, doesn't collapse, at least not yet, and so the Christian minority stays within the region well into the 20th century. Yet, there is still ethnic tension within the empire as its grip weakens. If the empire does collapse, history of ethnic civil war probably stays as it was in our timeline. That's just how it is. As for the Arabs to the south, the Middle East isn't simply divided into artificial states like Iraq or Syria after the war.
Man, that's already getting me to rethink a completely different reality, which is what happens to former Ottoman Empire when the British and French mandates come in that just carve up the Middle East. And as we know, this ends up fostering a lot of the tensions of the Middle East that we eventually snowball into today with kind of haphazard nature of the mandates that were created here. Yeah, I mean, I guess if the Ottoman Empire still exists, Middle Eastern history, which is so intertwined with world history today, with the conflicts there, could be a very different reality. So that's really getting me thinking for sure.
When the Ottomans do collapse, the Arabs unite under larger, more natural states. Iraq is non-existent, and instead is divided between Shia and Sunni Arabs. The Kurds have their own nation as well. Wars between the groups still happen, but destabilization between groups into civil war, like in our timeline, rarely are such an occurrence.
The actual Pan-Arab movement was, again, much more about what eventually would be pave way to... eventually like the creation of Israel and the Balfour Declaration, and that failed, and a lot of it on the Sunni Shia lines of trying to unify for that failed, but that Pan-Arab movement required that this movement. For independence from the Ottoman Empire would not have required the Sunni and Shiite it wouldn't have required a unification. They could have, again, drawn political borders more on those lines, which still would probably be a little messy, but not nearly as messy as what was imposed upon them after World War I by basically the Allied nations. So yeah, you could see that still happening, that movement for independence, but again based on the Sunni Shia ones, which it could still have a lot of issues, but would make a lot more cultural, ethnic, geographic sense than what was actually put in the Middle East, which has been a cause of so many problems afterwards.
Israel simply doesn't exist in this timeline, but there is a much larger Jewish population.
And just think about that timeline of what would have happened for the next 60 years if there actually is no Israel, which again with the British kind of paved the way for that the creation of that, starting with the World War I years. That's a very different timeline to think about.
Israel simply doesn't exist in this timeline, but there is a much larger Jewish population within Europe, especially, unsurprisingly, in Poland. There is never a British Palestine, and never even Hitler, so the Holocaust never forces Jews to flee to a new land. Could fascism still rise? Possibly, but obviously not in the manner of our timeline.
Why couldn't it?
It would be harder, having to rise in countries with histories of democracy. As a whole, we see a Western civilization
They're tying that
more
with the
socially
Jews?
conservative than our own. Without World War II, which created such a societal shift, generations don't become disinterested in the old order. Imperial might, empire, and colonies remain a desire because that was Germany's main prize for victory. Britain and France want their colonies
That's what I was
back.
wondering too.
America wants to be like Germany. Speaking of which, what is America doing? They never got involved in the war, and so the American public is largely neutral to a German victory. Of course, being culturally and economically closer to Britain meant that while the Allied loss was an issue, it wasn't catastrophic. What's done is done, and to the Americans, relationships had to be made with the victors and to mend ties. Being uninvolved in the war, the United States tries to reach across the aisle. It's not a global military leader, but economically it's strong. If the German economic plans worked, then they'd be a valuable partner.
So, I mean, London was basically the international like trade capital of the world at that time, and Britain really was the center of really the financial war, and that ended with World War I, even with them on the victorious side. So it seems like America would still have sort of by default sort of passed up those other nations to become the financial leader of the world, with New York actually kind of replacing London as the financial capital of the world. So I think that still would have existed. Yeah, you'd had them, they wouldn't have fought in the war, but it still seems like they would have kind of vaulted into an economic powerhouse regardless. Although they wouldn't have made all that money off of the war by supplying the Allies, that is true, but that's not necessarily the reason why America made that jump. It was more about the others, because of the effect of the war, getting pushed down that sort of ladder, however you want to describe it.
The millions of German immigrants across the Midwest don't have to abandon their heritage so quickly. In our timeline, the reason Germans assimilated so quickly was because of anti-German sentiment once America became involved in the war. They were discriminated and hated, abandoning their culture to fit in. Without a war, many can continue to speak their native language, even entire isolated towns in the Midwest. As a result, the United States has a far greater Germanic influence mixed in with its English population.
But what would that look like? What would a Germanic influence look like? There's just more of these communities. We know, like, for example, one example of the assimilation was a lot of Germans ended up changing their names from kind of the German sounding part, or German sounding, into more of like an English sounding. But I mean, that gives up, in name, but not necessarily in just culture necessarily. But yeah, I'm wondering what would that actually, they've kind of said a few times that German culture would continue on, but I don't really know what that means yet and what that would actually look like, and how would it be different.
Throughout the 20th century, this influences financial and diplomatic relationships with the new power across the Atlantic. Because so much would be shifted by this victory, I can't account for exact specifics going into the rest of the 20th century. Any event could randomly change the course of history, even if Germany did win.
That's what's hard about doing this.
The Great Depression certainly causes upheaval for countries across the world. But as a whole,
is there still a Great Depression? That's a good question. What do you think about that? Is there still a Great Depression, which is, indirectly linked with the war?
Simply following the events of our own timeline, whoever won the Great War forever shaped the 20th century in their image. Had Germany won, it has an immediate head start on this new age. Its Prussian influence, its economic might, and huge population means that the 20th century easily could have been the German century.
Well, they were kind of saying that a World War II would still probably have happened, just with kind of being flipped. But are we saying in this timeline that Germany would have also won the Second World War for sure under this? Would the Americans have gotten involved in that? They still have those ties to, especially British and French culture, but with a stronger German culture, would the United States have stayed neutral in that fact? Then you also call in what happened in World War II with America getting involved largely because of the attack of Japan. So would the German-Japanese relationship would probably maybe not exist in this alternate reality too, thus bringing out one of the influencing factors for America joining in, because if America joins in this timeline of World War II, or in this World War II, could that have led to a German defeat in a Second World War? Because if that happens, the German Second World War is a loss. then that changes the amount of influence of Germany after that, because they're saying like the 20th century is really going to belong to Germany for that. But that, yeah, branches off a whole bunch of things. So you probably can't just say if they win World War II that they will be the 20th century dominant nation. Bunch of factors change from that too.
This new era could look very similar to the old one, as European empires still fight for land. Mentalities remain the same, at least for a little while longer. Even if the Kaiser eventually fell out of favor, Germany still benefits from this war, even if its allies did not. And perhaps German as a culture is far more influential across the world, spreading 3 entire continents. Of course, this is simply one scenario, an exercise of alternate history. But it's fun to theorize.
Sure.
This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Okay. A lot of great what ifs. You get in a rabbit hole with alternative histories though, because it can't be one domino is different, goes in a different path, and then that's going to be the straight path. It just opens up more and more and more and more. And this being kind of the first real video I've seen on YouTube like this, gets me to lead how challenging this can be, because you can only go down one path when, again, the change of one path opens up a countless other new paths. So it got me thinking, but I guess it was fun and interesting just as almost like a mental exercise to do that. And I try to get my students to think in ways like that too, about how things would be different if events went a certain way. I think there's a critical thinking skill definitely involved in that that's important to think about. Then you come to appreciate more how events have consequences, both large and small in life. So that's good. Got me thinking a lot for sure about a lot of things. But either way, it was enjoyable, no matter what. Okay. All right, a few things on the way out. If you like this original video, be sure you support the original channel. There'll be a link down in the description. A few other ways you can support our channel here. One way is to join our Patreon. This channel has been nominated by a lot of people, and Patrons or Patreon members have a big influence on this channel too. I put up a weekly poll so that one of the videos or so that I do a week will be one chosen by patrons, by videos that had been recommended quite a bit, which is a lot, and getting a little more influence about what ends up coming on this channel. And right now it's set that patrons of all financial donation levels get to participate in that. That goes a long way to support this channel as well. You can also join our history community on our Discord server. There is a link down in the description below, and I'd love to see you over there as well. Lots of ways to support the channel, but never required. Just very much appreciated if you're ever able to do that. But most important thing is you're here along on this journey and hopefully having a good time like I am. All right, with that, I think we'll go ahead and cut it here. Until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.